Hello, everyone. This is going to be 15.7 Social Issues of the 1950s. There's a famous quote that I love here from a movie called The Wild One with Marlon Brando in 1953. And somebody asked Marlon Brando's character, Johnny, she says, "Hey, Johnny, what are you rebelling against?" And he says, "What do you got?" Anyways, our objectives, we're going to summarize the arguments made by critics who rejected the culture of the 1950s. We're going to describe the causes and effects of the urban and rural poverty. And we're going to explain the problems that many minority groups faced during the post war era. So let's look at critics and rebels during this time period. Not everybody was willing to jump on the bandwagon of the 1950s and create a nuclear family. It also saw a rise in sort of a rebellious streak among many younger, especially individuals in America. So, books like The Lonely Crowd said that basically Americans were losing their individuality to suburbs and franchises and were just sort of lonely and sort of lost a little bit. We see The Catcher in the Rye, which thought the new culture of the 1950s was all just a front. It was phoniness. Meanwhile, Betty Friedan, who was sort of looking at how women were treated during the 1950s, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, saying that women deserved a place that wasn't in the home, and being homemakers was demeaning. She actually said that, women are missing something in their lives. There's some sort of question mark in their lives that needed to be answered, and the answer was not just being a homemaker, not just being in the kitchen all the time. So here is Betty Friedan, who was alive from 1921 to 2006, originally from Illinois, but she moved around as she married. She was a writer, she was a women's rights activist. She attended Smith College, traditionally an all female college. She also helped to co found the National Organization for Women, or NOW, in 1966. And the quote from her is, when she stopped conforming, she being women, when she stopped conforming to the conventional picture of femininity, she finally began to enjoy being a woman. Now, a group of writers and artists during this time also refused to conform. They became known as the beatniks. They sort of wore what they wanted to. They grew their hair long. They talked in beat lingo, man. And they wrote anti-conformity books like On the Road, which is Jack Kerouac's sort of stream of consciousness of being out on the road, and also Allen Ginsberg's long poem Howl. We also see a lot of rebellious, unhappy teens pop up in movies like Marlon Brando in The Wild One and James Dean in movies like Giant and Rebel Without a Cause. So here's the opening line of Allen Ginsberg's Howl. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, drag-on, and so on and so forth. And here is James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, sort of this movie about disaffected youth who don't really know what they want to do, so they just kind of drive around in their cars and get into fights and things like that. The soundtrack to this was rock and roll, which hit the mainstream America when white DJs started to call what they used to call race music, African American music. One of the first rock and roll stars was a St. Louisan named Chuck Berry. He once said it used to be called boogie woogie, now it's called used to be called the blues, used to be called rhythm and blues, it's called rock now. And Chuck Berry popped onto the scene with some of the earliest rock and roll songs, and became famous for it in the 1950s. He helped to inspire white musicians like Elvis Presley, who helped bring rock into the mainstream and had crossover hits. So here's Chuck Berry, who once said, I grew up thinking art was pictures until I got into music, and I found I was an artist and I didn't paint. And here's Elvis Presley, who once said, rhythm is something you either have or you don't have, but when you have it all over. Now, this generation, this beat generation and rock and roll and anti-establishment, had some parents really scared that, these kids are turning into something fearsome and weird and different and dangerous. Um, Ministers actually said that rock music released demonic urges, and after Elvis showed up on TV live doing his dancing to "You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog," they actually only shot him from the waist up after that. But it did have a huge influence on the youth culture, and inspired a lot of the music of the 60s, the British invasion, all the way up through today. Now, let's look at poverty in the cities and rural areas. So, not everybody was living this good life, especially in the suburbs. life in farming areas and among African Americans was getting worse. So we see the white flight of the suburbs hit the inner cities very hard. Basically, the only people left in inner cities were people who could not afford to leave, and that was mostly African Americans who were left in these cities. So we see things like people try to reverse the trend with urban renewal. They try to destroy old housing and create new affordable housing, big, like, public housing spaces, apartments like that. However, many of them did not last. And we also see that urban renewal basically tore down huge African American sections of cities like St. Louis. So here's an example of St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe, built in the 1950s and torn down in the 1970s because they had failed utterly at that idea of let's offer affordable, safe housing to low income African Americans in the inner cities. Instead, these places became rampant with crime, drugs, poverty, gangs, violence, all the worst of the worst. And it was not just inner cities. Urban poor in the South and Appalachian workers in coal mines and farmers were all pretty well hit by the 1950s. America looked rich as long as you looked at, Madison Avenue in the suburbs, but there were some people who were still struggling. Some people who were struggling relocated to the Sun Belt. That was a big trend of the time. Others just kind of kept doing what they were doing as best they could. Now, lastly, let's look at the struggle of minorities. So, we've already talked a bit about the struggle of African Americans, and this was just the start of the civil rights movement, as we're going to see. However, African Americans and other minority groups were hit very badly by the 1950s. Puerto Ricans were moving to New York during this time, partially because giant sugar companies were buying them out and forcing them off their land in Puerto Rico. So they migrated to New York City, and they found discrimination waiting for them. If you don't believe me, watch the musical West Side Story. Now, some Mexican workers had been welcomed during World War II thanks to what we called the Bracero program, but now they were finding themselves shoved back out. They tried to save their jobs through unionization. However, many were still deported by Truman and Eisenhower under what was called Operation Wetback. A wetback is a derogatory term for a farm worker, usually Latin American farm workers. So here are immigrants apprehended and being taken back to the border in Operation Wetback.